Minnesota, 2016. A cold case solved in real time. One that shattered a quiet rural town. 5-year-old Alayna Jeanne Ertl, a bubbly, affectionate child adored by everyone who knew her, vanished from her family home before sunrise. What followed was a frantic search across counties, a father's truck missing, and a trail of clues pointing towards someone the family trusted completely. As investigators pushed deeper, evidence twisted into darker territory, mistaken assumptions, emotional dead ends, and a race against time none of them could afford to lose. But this case does have an ending, one built on a chilling confession that would expose the truth hiding in plain sight. Before we begin, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. In the quiet town of Watkins, the night of August 19th felt like any other late summer evening. Families settled in after long work days. Porch lights glowed softly against the darkening horizon, and a warm breeze carried the sound of distant laughter from a local softball field. On that field was Matt Ertl, enjoying a familiar Friday ritual with his teammates. Among them was a man he considered a friend, someone who'd spent evenings at the Ertl home, shared meals with the family, and blended easily into their routine. Matt had no reason to believe that bringing him home that night would alter the course of their lives forever. Inside the Ertl residence, the late-night calm drifted across the rooms like a protective blanket. Toys rested where Alayna had last placed them. A half-colored picture sat on the kitchen counter. Around 2 a.m., Kayla lifted her sleepy 5-year-old into bed, brushing stray strands of hair from her daughter's face. It was a moment so ordinary, so safe, that it barely registered. Yet it would become the final memory she'd ever have of her child alive. When dawn approached, the household should have been stirring with the first sounds of morning. But instead, a heavy stillness hung in the air. Kayla noticed it first, an unexplained quiet, an absence where Alayna's morning chatter should have been. With a growing sense of unease, she checked her daughter's room. The blankets were tossed aside. The bed was empty, and that emptiness spread outward like a shockwave. Matt's truck was missing. Their overnight guest was nowhere to be found. Doors that had been locked were now ajar. Panic took over as the family raced from room to room, calling Alayna's name with voices already cracking under fear. For a few brief minutes, denial served as a fragile lifeline. Maybe she wandered outside. Maybe she was playing hide-and-seek. Maybe this was all a misunderstanding. But the truth settled hard when minutes passed with no sign of her. By mid-morning, the Meeker County Sheriff's Office arrived. Officers scanned the doorway, the hallways, the child's room. They saw no signs of a chaotic struggle, no loud break-in, just a terrifyingly controlled disappearance. And that raised even darker implications. This wasn't random. This wasn't opportunistic. Someone had walked into the heart of the family's home, lifted a sleeping child from her bedroom, and vanished without a sound. As word spread, neighbors stepped outside, gathering on lawns with grave expressions. The idea that a 5-year-old girl could be taken from her own home in the middle of the night was something no one wanted to accept. Yet here it was, in front of officers, parents, and a community suddenly gripped by fear. Who would take Alayna? And why would a trusted family friend disappear at the exact same moment? Those early hours offered no answers, only dread. And the first clues that surfaced would lead investigators down a path far darker than anyone could imagine, toward a truth waiting in the shadows just miles away. By 10 a.m., the search had already widened beyond Watkins. What began as a frantic sweep of the Ertls' property quickly expanded into a coordinated community effort, with deputies moving through the quiet neighborhoods and volunteers spreading out across nearby fields and gravel back roads. People who had never met the family poured out of their homes, driven by instinct and the horror of imagining a child alone somewhere. They searched ditches, small parks, and wooded trails where families often walked on weekends. Every few minutes, someone would call out Alayna's name, their voices growing shakier with each unanswered echo. But even in those early hours, something felt wrong. Officers with decades of experience recognized it immediately. Children Alayna's age don't wander off miles from home, not in the dead of night, not without leaving some trace. And the detail that the family tried not to dwell on, but couldn't avoid, gnawed at every investigator. A family friend had vanished at the exact same time, along with Matt's truck. As the morning sun climbed higher, the case shifted from missing child to potential abduction. That shift came sharply into focus when Matt mentioned the cell phone he'd left inside the truck. Deputies moved quickly, contacting the carrier and initiating a track on its signal. Moments later, the phone pinged. Not from Watkins, not even from Meeker County. It was moving, jumping from tower to tower, cutting across rural Minnesota in a direction that made no sense for a lost child, but every bit of sense for a fleeing adult. Each ping painted a picture of speed, determination, a purpose none of them wanted to consider. By 1:30 p.m., the decision became unavoidable. Authorities issued an Amber Alert, broadcasting Alayna's photo to phones, radios, and televisions across the state. For a fleeting moment, hope surged. Calls started coming in. People believed they had spotted the truck on highways, near gas stations, on small town streets. Officers chased down each lead with urgency, but one after another, they fizzled. Wrong truck, wrong driver, wrong place. Meanwhile, the cell trail continued its silent testimony. The signal paused in Todd County for nearly 2 hours, long enough to raise dread in the pit of every officer's stomach, before going dark completely. Someone had switched off the phone. Someone didn't want to be found. As the hours passed, the atmosphere around the command post shifted. What had begun with frantic optimism had cooled into something colder, heavier. Investigators exchanged looks that said what none of them wanted to say out loud. The longer a child is missing, the more likely the outcome turns tragic. Still, they pushed on, expanding the search radius, rerunning camera footage from gas stations and convenience stores, and urging the public to stay alert. Parents across Minnesota held their children a little tighter that afternoon. The thought of a 5-year-old taken from her own bed in the middle of the night was enough to shake even the toughest deputies. Then, just as teams were preparing to widen the search again, a call came into dispatch, calm, steady, and chillingly direct. A man from Todd County said his son had asked to use the family cabin that morning. His son's name? Zachary Anderson. It was the first true break in the case, and the moment hope turned sharply toward fear. Afternoon sunlight filtered through soft layers of cloud as the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension officially stepped into the hunt. Their arrival shifted the atmosphere instantly. What had been a desperate, fast-moving local search transformed into a full-scale statewide operation. Helicopters circled overhead, cutting across the quiet sky with rhythmic thumps. 9 teams were deployed, noses pressed to the dirt, weaving through tall grass and following scents the human eye could never detect. Officers from multiple counties coordinated through radio traffic that grew faster and more urgent with every passing minute. Everyone understood the stakes. Everyone knew time was slipping. The data trail from Matt's cell phone, left behind in the stolen truck, narrowed the search toward the small town of Browerville. Nothing about Browerville should have mattered. But then investigators found what would become one of the most chilling images of the entire case. Surveillance footage from a convenience store captured Zachary Todd Anderson walking through the doors alone. He wasn't panicked. He wasn't hurried. He moved with the unsettling calm of someone running an errand. But most disturbing of all was the one thing the camera did not show: any sign of little Alayna. It was a silent confirmation of every fear investigators had tried to suppress. Whatever had happened in those early hours, Anderson was now without the child he had taken. Detectives began reconstructing his movements with forensic precision. They pulled receipts from the store, matching timestamps to the cell tower pings. They interviewed clerks and customers who remembered seeing him. Did he seem rushed? Nervous? Was anyone else in the truck? Slowly, a timeline emerged. Anderson had driven north, deeper into an area known for dense woods, secluded trails, and scattered family cabins. Places where someone could hide. Places where someone could disappear. Then came the call that changed everything. At 2 p.m., dispatch relayed a message from Anderson's father. His voice was steady, but beneath it was unmistakable dread. He explained that earlier that morning, Zachary had asked permission to use the family cabin near Motley. He hadn't said why. He hadn't given details. But the request struck him as unusual enough that, after hearing the Amber Alert, he wondered if it meant something terrible. Officers moved immediately. They split into two coordinated teams. One group prepared to head straight for the cabin, armed with photographs, tracking equipment, and the grim awareness that they might be walking into a crime scene. The second team set up to trace footprints, tire impressions, and any physical signs that could point toward where Anderson had gone, and more importantly, where he might have left Alayna. When the first team reached the property, they weren't met with the peaceful quiet of a family retreat. Instead, they found Matt's missing GMC Sierra hidden deep in a ravine, angled in a way that suggested deliberate concealment. Branches had been dragged across the metal. Dirt had been smeared on the windows. It wasn't abandoned, it was hidden. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was worse. Officers found a 20-gauge shotgun resting near a table, ammunition arranged beside it. And on that same table lay a note, short, cryptic, and heavy with the tone of someone preparing to end their life. A suicide note from Anderson. Outside, the forest stood unervingly still. No birdsong, no wind rustling the treetops, just an oppressive silence hanging over the cabin like a warning. The scene felt frozen, suspended between discovery and horror. And somewhere in the miles of tangled brush surrounding them, investigators felt it, a sense that they were close. Painfully close. But they still didn't know what waited just beyond the tree line. And they had no idea that only a short distance away, in the murky water of a swamp, a figure was already standing motionless, watching. Deputies stepped into the dense undergrowth, their boots sinking into the soft, waterlogged earth as they followed faint footprints stamped into the mud. The prints were shallow but unmistakably fresh. Heel marks pressed into the soil, the faint drag of a shoe cutting through moss. Each step forward deepened the silence around them. Even the forest seemed to hold its breath. AK-9 units strained at the leash, pulling sharply toward a narrow trail that cut away from the cabin and disappeared into a wall of thick brush. The path was barely a suggestion. Broken saplings, bent grasses, and places where the ground looked scraped, as if someone had stumbled. Officers exchanged tense glances. These were signs of recent movement, signs of someone trying to push deeper into isolation. The team braced themselves. They knew what they were looking for. They feared what they would find. Minutes stretched into an hour as they moved through the woods. The deeper they went, the darker it became. Sunlight filtered through the treetops in thin, fractured beams. They called Alayna's name over and over, voices cracking through the stillness. Each time, the return echo was faint, swallowed by the trees. The forest floor was slick, covered with damp leaves that muffled their steps. Shadows moved strangely among the reeds, tricking their eyes with shapes that vanished when they turned to look. But something felt undeniably wrong. The woods carried a heaviness, an eerie, oppressive atmosphere that every officer sensed. It was quiet in a way that wasn't natural. No chirps, no distant rustling, just a thick blanket of silence, punctuated only by their own breathing. At 4:30 p.m., that silence shattered. The deputies froze as the marsh ahead came into view. The high grass parted just enough for them to see a figure standing knee-deep in murky, stagnant water. His clothes were soaked. His arms hung limp at his sides, and his expression, blank, hollow, stripped of anything resembling fear or remorse, sent a ripple of dread through the team. Zachary Anderson. He didn't look surprised to see them. He didn't try to flee. He simply stood there, water gently lapping against his legs. One deputy noticed the cut on his left wrist, a thin line, not deep enough to be fatal, but enough to suggest a failed attempt at something darker. The sight only deepened their unease. They approached cautiously, weapons drawn, but voices steady. When asked where Alayna was, Anderson avoided their eyes. He muttered excuses, half-thoughts, deflections that barely formed sentences. It was like speaking to someone whose mind had retreated far beyond the present moment. But the deputies pressed harder. They had no choice. Finally, under mounting pressure, he whispered the words they feared most. "She's in the swamp." The stillness of the forest seemed to thicken around them. Officers exchanged a single look, half despair, half determination, before moving past him. Anderson offered no guidance at first, but eventually he turned and trudged through the waterlogged brush, leading them away from the path and into an unforgiving tangle of reeds and bramble. Their steps quickened, their breath tightened, dread pooled in their stomachs with each yard they covered. They knew they were close. And at 6:02 p.m., when the water parted and reality surfaced before them, the sight that emerged from the swamp would remain etched in their memories long after the case closed. The swamp widened into a shallow, murky pool, one of those still, forgotten places where the water barely moved and the air felt unnaturally heavy. Patches of reeds jutted from the surface like broken fingers, and bits of debris drifted aimlessly in slow circles. As the deputies stepped closer, Anderson stood motionless behind them, pointing with a limp, trembling hand toward the darkest part of the pool. His eyes didn't meet theirs. He simply stared past them, hollow and unblinking, as if he were watching a scene from someone else's life. The officers waded forward. Each step sent ripples across the water, distorting the reflection of the gray sky above. Their boots sank into the cold mud beneath, and the icy water soaked through their uniforms, chilling them straight to the bone. None of them felt the cold. Not really. Their hearts were pounding too hard, their breath caught somewhere between dread and desperate hope. Then one deputy saw it, just beneath the surface. A small shape, still, unmoving, the outline of a child. The forest seemed to hold its breath as the team moved as one, their voices dropping to whispers. They reached down, hands steady with training, yet trembling with emotion, and lifted her from the water. At 6:02 p.m., they recovered 5-year-old Alayna Jeanne Ertl, unclothed, lifeless, 80 miles from home. The world narrowed to silence. Not the peaceful kind, the crushing kind. The kind that weighs on the chest and sinks deep into memory. Even the wind seemed to stop. Officers who had seen the worst of humanity still felt something inside them break. A child who had gone to bed safe in her home just hours earlier was now the victim of an act so brutal, so senseless, that no amount of training could prepare them for the reality of it. They wrapped her gently, shielding her from the cold air as if she could still feel it. Several deputies turned away, blinking back tears. Others silently bowed their heads. The grief in that small clearing was overwhelming, the kind that seeped into the soil and stayed there. The truth of what had happened would come later in clinical, devastating detail. The autopsy would confirm what the scene already screamed: strangulation, blunt force trauma, sexual assault, and the person responsible, a man who played softball with her father, who slept under the same roof, who had eaten meals at their table, was now standing in handcuffs, staring at the ground as officers restrained him. As they led Anderson away, none of the deputies felt triumph. Only grief, rage, and a solemn vow that justice would be pursued with everything they had. But even as they believed the case was nearly unshakable, supported by forensic evidence, cell data, witness accounts, and the recovery of the victim, no one could predict what the courts would do next. Because soon, the investigation would collide with legal obstacles that threatened to unravel the very confession that had led them to Alayna and open the door to a battle none of them were ready for. In the months that followed the discovery in Cass County, the case moved from swamp and forest into the structured, fluorescent-lit world of the court system. Prosecutors wasted no time. They filed a staggering 19 charges against Zachary Anderson, ranging from first and second-degree murder to criminal sexual conduct, kidnapping, interference with a dead body, and motor vehicle theft. On paper, it looked airtight. The timeline placed him with Alayna. The cell phone trail matched his movements. Surveillance cameras captured him alone, and officers had found him at the scene, drenched, shaking, and pointing toward the swamp. Yet cases that appear strong in the public eye often unfold differently once they enter the courtroom. And this one was no exception. As the legal machinery turned, small cracks began to emerge, cracks that widened with every motion filed by Anderson's defense team. Their argument hinged on a critical point, that Anderson had invoked his Fifth Amendment right to remain silent, and investigators continued questioning him anyway. Specifically, they targeted the moment when he admitted Alayna was in the swamp and led officers to her location. His defense claimed that information had been extracted in violation of constitutional protections. And then came a moment no one anticipated. After weeks of reviewing transcripts, the judge issued a stunning ruling. Anderson's initial statements, including the one revealing where Alayna's body was, were inadmissible in court. The news hit prosecutors like a punch to the gut. It meant that one of the most direct pieces of evidence, the word from the suspect himself, could not be used before jury. Officers who had stood waist-deep in the swamp, who had watched Anderson point toward the water, felt the ground shift beneath them. How could something so obvious suddenly be considered off-limits? Overnight, the state's legal strategy began to shift. Meetings stretched late into the evening. Whiteboards filled with alternative evidentiary paths. Every assumption had to be re-examined. Key details surrounding the recovery of Alayna's body were now at risk of being struck from the case unless prosecutors could prove that the search itself, the helicopters circling overhead, the K-9 units tracking the scent, the infrared-equipped aircraft sweeping over the marsh, would inevitably have led to the discovery without Anderson's statements. Motions flew back and forth like volleys in a legal storm. The defense demanded exclusion of anything connected to Anderson's inadmissible confession. The prosecution countered that the search perimeter was rapidly expanding and that the resources deployed made the discovery unavoidable. Each hearing brought new tension. Each ruling carried enormous weight. The Ertl family sat through these proceedings quietly, hands clasped, eyes fixed forward. Their grief was still raw, their exhaustion visible. But now they feared something else, something they had never prepared for. That the man responsible for taking their daughter's life could escape the fullest consequences because of a technicality. That years of appeals and retrials could follow. That justice could slip into limbo. Behind the scenes, prosecutors worked relentlessly. They mapped timelines, reconstructed search grids, demonstrated the sheer scale of the operation that had been underway. And eventually, they convinced the judge that law enforcement would have found Alayna regardless of Anderson's statements. Some evidence was spared, some was not, but the core of the case remained intact. Still, the tension was palpable. Would a jury, faced with the omission of certain key details, fully grasp the cruelty of the crime? Would the defense sow enough doubt to complicate what should have been a straightforward verdict? The prospect of a lengthy trial, one that could re-traumatize the family, loomed. Then, just as uncertainty reached its peak, just when prosecutors braced for a grueling courtroom battle, and just when it seemed the defense might gain enough leverage to stretch this case out for years, Anderson made a decision no one expected, one that would change everything that followed. March 2nd, 2018. Nearly 2 years after the tragedy, the courtroom in Minnesota carried the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air itself was holding its breath. Wooden benches creaked as family members, reporters, and law enforcement officers took their seats. Everyone knew this hearing mattered. No one expected it to change everything. Zachary Anderson was escorted in, his expression empty, shoulders slumped, hands cuffed tightly at his waist. He looked neither left nor right. He didn't acknowledge the Ertl family. He didn't scan the room. He simply stared straight ahead, hollow and detached, as though whatever humanity had once lived inside him had drained away long ago. The judge began the standard pretrial questions. Anderson answered quietly, emotionless, offering nothing beyond monosyllables. Then, as the judge prepared to move to procedural matters, Anderson did something that stopped the entire room cold. He said he wanted to change his plea, without warning, without negotiation, without any offer on the table. He pled guilty to first-degree murder while committing criminal sexual conduct, an offense that carried Minnesota's most severe punishment, life in prison with no possibility of parole. The additional 18 charges filed against him were dismissed under the plea agreement, but the single conviction ensured he would never walk free again. For a moment, no one reacted. The words hung in the air, unfamiliar and disorienting, as if the room needed time to catch up with what had just happened. Then came the wave of stunned realization. Prosecutor Benjamin Lindstrom later admitted he was blindsided. There was no incentive for Anderson to confess. The state hadn't offered him a reduced sentence. No evidence had been suppressed that forced his hand. And yet, here he was, admitting openly to the kidnapping, the assault, the strangulation, and the disposal of Alayna's body in Cass County. Some speculated it was guilt. Others believed it was resignation. A few wondered whether Anderson simply wanted to avoid the painful, public exposure of a full trial. Whatever the motivation, the result was the same. The legal battle that had once threatened to drag on for months, if not years, ended in a single, shocking moment. For the Ertl family, the confession cut sharply in two directions. On one side was relief, the assurance that the man who had destroyed their world would never harm another child again. The plea spared them from enduring the agonizing details of testimony. It protected them from hearing the crime dissected in front of a jury. But the other side was agony, the knowledge that with the case closed, they would never hear Anderson explain why. No motive, no context, no clarity. The questions that had tormented them since that August morning would remain unanswered forever. Even so, the confession delivered something the community desperately needed: closure. A sense that the fight for justice had not been in vain. A reassurance that, despite the legal turbulence and constitutional complications, the truth had prevailed. Still, this was not the end of Alayna's story. Not by a long stretch. Because in the weeks, months, and years that followed, what the Ertl family chose to do next would transform their grief, not into silence, but into a legacy of love that reached far beyond the courtroom walls. And that transformation began almost immediately after the verdict. News of Alayna's death rippled through Minnesota like a shockwave, sudden, devastating, and impossible to ignore. Watkins was a small, close-knit town where people knew their neighbors, held doors open for strangers, and gathered for Friday softball games as naturally as breathing. The idea that a 5-year-old girl could be taken from her own bed by someone the family trusted shook everyone to their core. It wasn't just a tragedy. It was a violation of the very sense of safety the community believed it had. Within hours, the Ertl family home transformed into a physical symbol of shared grief. Angel figurines began appearing on the lawn. One, then two, then dozens. People placed flowers, teddy bears, handwritten notes, and drawings from local children who didn't fully understand what had happened, but knew they had lost someone their parents spoke of with tears in their eyes. The candlelight vigil at St. Anthony Church offered a moment of unity amid the heartbreak. Hundreds gathered, holding flickering candles that cast soft glows across somber faces. The church steps overflowed with people. Neighbors, classmates of Alayna's older siblings, former teachers, distant relatives, and complete strangers who simply felt compelled to stand with the family. Some prayed. Others held hands. Many cried openly. And amidst the sea of candles, the Ertls stood surrounded by a wave of love that momentarily softened the sharpness of their grief. Support poured in from every corner of the state. A GoFundMe created to help with funeral and memorial costs surpassed $40,000 in just 2 days, a staggering number for such a small town. Donations came from people who had never even driven through Watkins but felt compelled to help in any way they could. Meals were delivered. Letters arrived in stacks. The community didn't just mourn, it mobilized. In the midst of unimaginable loss, Kayla Ertl made a choice that would change the trajectory of her family's healing. On what would have been Alayna's next birthday, Halloween, a day her daughter loved, Kayla refused to let grief be the only memory. She held a public celebration instead. Friends and families gathered in costume, bringing toys and donations. What began as a simple gesture, marking a birthday that should have been filled with candy buckets and laughter, became something much larger. That celebration planted the seed for what would soon become Sharing Alayna's Love, a charity dedicated to supporting sick children and families in need. Kayla wanted to channel the love her daughter radiated in life into something that could uplift others. Over time, the annual Halloween party blossomed into a full-scale community event, complete with games, raffles, costume contests, and donation drives. Each year, it grew bigger. More volunteers, more families helped, more stories touched. Through the charity, the Ertl family delivered toys to children in local hospitals, supported families experiencing their own losses, and provided small moments of joy to those who needed it most. In every act of kindness, Alayna's memory breathed again. But perhaps the most powerful tribute came in September 2023. After 2 years of collaboration between local artists, businesses, and volunteers, a life-sized bronze statue of Alayna was unveiled in McCarthy Park. The statue captured her in motion, arms slightly lifted, hair swept back, an expression of gentle joy on her face. It stood as a permanent reminder of her spirit, a place where parents brought their children, where flowers were still placed on anniversaries, where strangers paused to reflect. The statue wasn't just a memorial. It was a symbol of what a community can become when love answers tragedy. Yet even with this outpouring of support, candles, donations, tributes, charities, one question lingered quietly beneath the surface. How does a family truly rebuild after losing what they loved most? Today, Alayna's story endures, not only as a heartbreaking crime, but as a powerful testament to what resilience can look like in the aftermath of unimaginable tragedy. In the years since her passing, her family has refused to let her memory be defined solely by the darkness of that August morning. Instead, they have built a legacy rooted in love, community, and the determination to ensure that her spirit continues to touch lives far beyond the small town of Watkins, Minnesota. Through Sharing Alayna's Love, the charity founded in her honor, the Ertl family has transformed grief into generosity. They've delivered toys to children in hospitals, provided financial support to families experiencing crises of their own, and turned a child's birthday, Halloween, into an annual celebration of kindness. Each year, volunteers gather to pack care bags, organize events, and spread compassion in places where it's needed most. Alayna's memory has become a light reaching into hospital rooms, living rooms, and community centers, offering comfort where fear and uncertainty often linger. The ripple effect of her case extends beyond charity. The investigation ignited deeper conversations across Minnesota about child safety, mental health intervention, and the dangers of ignoring early behavioral red flags. Anderson's disturbing history, behavior once dismissed as teenage missteps, became a haunting example of what can happen when signs of predatory fixation go unaddressed. Law enforcement, community leaders, and families alike began to advocate more strongly for awareness, training, and better protective systems. Yet even with these broader societal shifts, the final chapter of this story will always belong to Alayna herself, the little girl whose smile, energy, and innocence inspired a movement of compassion. Her legacy is carried in the arms of children who receive donated toys, in the gratitude of families who benefit from the charity's outreach, and in the community events that keep her memory alive with color, laughter, and hope. People who never met her now know her name. Communities that never knew her family now carry her spirit in their traditions. And parents across the state hold their children a little closer, a little tighter, because her story reminded them how precious and fragile life can be. In the end, the legal case is closed. Justice was delivered swiftly and decisively, ensuring that the man responsible will never again step foot outside a prison. But the story, her story, continues in every act of kindness done in her name, in every conversation sparked about protection and awareness, in every candle lit in McCarthy Park beside her bronze statue. Alayna's life was short, but the impact she left behind stretches endlessly forward. A legacy built not from tragedy, but from love. And that legacy will carry her memory long into the future. The kidnapping and murder of 5-year-old Alayna Jeanne Ertl shook Minnesota to its core. It was a case defined by betrayal, the kind that hides behind familiarity, trust, and the comfort of routine. A family friend became the unthinkable threat, and a quiet community found itself thrust into a nightmare it never imagined. But through exhaustive police work, coordinated statewide search efforts, and ultimately, a full and unexpected confession, the truth surfaced. Justice was served, and the man responsible will never walk free again. Yet, in the story of Alayna's life, justice is only one chapter. What stands above everything else is the endurance and resilience of the Ertl family. Faced with a loss no parent should ever endure, they chose not to let tragedy define their daughter's memory. Instead, they transformed that grief into purpose. Through sharing Alayna's love, charity events, community outreach, and the creation of lasting memorials, they turned pain into a legacy that lifts others in their darkest moments. Children in hospitals receive toys because of her. Families in crisis receive support in her name. And in McCarthy Park, a statue of Alayna reminds everyone that even short lives can leave deep, lasting marks. The case is solved. The story is closed. But the impact of one small child, her joy, her laughter, her kindness, will never fade. If this case moved you, take a second to share your thoughts in the comments below. Every story deserves to be remembered.